All right, by popular demand, I'm going to do a follow-up to the other Latin suffixes video that we did for Spanish, how to intuit words in Spanish without having to necessarily look them up by recognizing common suffixes in English and finding their counterpart suffix in Spanish. These come from Latin and from Old Greek. I've got some more patterns that y'all can use. Remember that these rules are not entirely consistent and they do have exceptions. But if you're in a situation where you need to use a word and you don't know the word, if you know the word in English and you can recognize its suffix, it's going to be a pretty solid guess at least. The first one that I'm going to show off, I put here exceptions because this one here, I think is one of the categories that we've covered so far that has the most exceptions. So I would say this one is the most dubious, the one you should probably look up and learn exceptions to, but you can still, I would say it's still a solid guess to use this suffix pattern recognition tool. But let's start it. So this one is words in English that end in ANCE or ENCE, and they end up in Spanish as ANCE, ANCIA, or ENCIA. So examples, we have distancia, sustancia, importancia, abundancia, tolerancia, elegancia. Importantly, just a fun fact, actually not that important, but cool for spelling in Spanish, sustancia drops the B that would be in English substance. Sustancia, that happens a lot when you have that prefix sub in English words. Often, it might be always, I can't think of an example when this doesn't happen, but at the very least, often that B will just get dropped. For instance, if you have your phone or your computer in Spanish and you use YouTube, you might see the word suscriptores without the B, suscriptores, or suscribir, to subscribe. That B in the prefix sub often gets dropped in Spanish in lots of words. So exceptions to these ones here, because there are many, and so I just wanted to cover a couple ones that are common. Performance is not performancia, it is actuación, which comes from the verb actuar, which means to act, behave in a certain way, right? Insurance is not insurancia, it's seguro, very common word that you ought to know. Attendance is not atendancia, it's asistencia. Interestingly, this comes from a verb as well, asistir, which is a false cognate, or I prefer to call it a false friend. False friends are words that look similar in English, but do not mean the same thing. For instance, the term embarrassed in English, famously, this is the most common one, you don't say embarazado, because that actually means pregnant. Asistir, the verb, it's a false cognate. It does not mean to assist. It rather means to attend. And interestingly, the verb atender in English, or rather in Spanish, does not always mean the same thing as to attend, because in English, this is kind of a side note, but in English, attend can mean two very different things. One, it can be like to attend a class, or it can be to attend to something, meaning to give it your attention, right? To attend to a person. So for instance, at my work, because I work in a customer-facing place, I often will ask people, ya lo atendieron? Did they already attend to you, right? I use the verb atender, but you cannot use it in Spanish in the way of like attending a meeting or attending a class, only in attending to a person. And interestingly, you would often say, in that example of mine, in my work, you would think to assist. Has somebody assisted you, right? Like, have we already assisted you? But we would actually say atender. And then to say to attend something, we would say asistir. Kind of a little flip of those two verbs. Maybe we'll do a false friend video and we can cover that more in depth. But asistencia would be attendance. Maintenance is not what would that even be? Mantenancia, it's mantenimiento. Prevalence is not prevalencia, it's predominio. Just some common ones. But now to some that are more consistent. Words in English ending with OUS, this would be adjectives. They're going to end in OSO, or they're going to end in OSA if the adjective is describing something that's feminine. and OSO if it's describing something that's masculine. That's why I put these little at signs, because I think it well demonstrates the idea that it can go masculine or feminine. Famoso, furioso, misterioso, nervioso, delicioso, religioso. One minor change that's made is that in the word nervous, this extra I is added into it as well. It's not nervoso, it's nervioso. But I thought that was similar enough to still put it in the category. I actually was inspired to do this follow-up video because it was requested by one of my most loyal followers, Gun24, to do some that are themed around medicine. And so this one's kind of an interesting one. OMA stays OMA, and almost always these words are going to stay the same. A lot of medical terms are going to be in here. Carcinoma, melanoma, sarcoma, glioma, glaucoma. I included lymphoma, but importantly, to maintain proper orthographic rules in Spanish, we have to change the spelling of lymphoma to linfoma. We change the M to an N, the PH to an F, and the first Y, or the only Y, to an I, linfoma. But maybe we'll do another video one day about like all the spelling rules in Spanish. The reason I include it still in here and not as an exception is because it still follows the rule. The rule just accounts for, all of these rules just account for the strict spelling rules in Spanish, something that we do not have in English. English is a very inclusive language. We try to include, you know, the pronunciation of loaner words from other languages and the spelling of loaner words for other languages. Makes English a very cool language, but the unfortunate consequence of that is it makes it so freaking difficult to learn. Next one, IVE, and IV becomes IVO or IVA if it's describing a feminine word, because this one here as well is a rule for adjectives. So they are going to be dependent on the gender of the noun which they're describing. Exhaustivo, productivo, relativo, activo, efectivo, creativo, selectivo. Seems pretty self-explanatory. We would just switch it to selectiva, relativa, activa, productiva, see if we are describing feminine nouns. Next one, ABLE and IBLE, they just stay the same. Any words with those suffixes of able or ible are going to stay the same with very little exception. Adaptable, probable, comparable, visible, posible, flexible, terrible. Note that another spelling rule that perhaps we can cover in a future video, the double S of the word possible gets dropped. It just changes to one single S in posible. Another one exception to this one is like edible would not be edible. It would be I think comestible. I can't remember actually. I'll have to look it up. I don't really say edible that often. Next rule, ANT and ENT rules. They effectively say the same, except you add an extra E at the end of the word. Importante, elegante, inteligente, consistente, suficiente, residente. Note that in suficiente, not coming from English, that's not how it works, but relative to, contrasted with English, when we spell sufficient, we include two Fs, but we don't do two Fs. There's no double Fs in Spanish, so it just switches to suficiente. Next one would be MENT becoming MENTO. Instrumento, documento, monumento, argumento, experimento. Pretty self-explanatory. Next one, the AL rule. AL words that have the suffix AL are basically going to say the same. Try to get the glare out of there. We've got natural, global, legal, profesional, cultural. Note that the double F in the word professional changes to a single F because, again, we don't do double Fs in Spanish. Next one, IZE turning into IZAR. This is a verb rule. So good one to know because verbs are, you know, in my opinion, the most important part of speech in learning a language, right? My methodology is very verb centric. So IZE to IZAR, we can learn a ton of verbs this way. What do we have? Modernizar, finalizar, organizar, especializar, fertilizar. Another valuable spelling and also pronunciation tip for Spanish words. Especializar. In English, we say specialize, not especialize. But the reason that E is there is because in Spanish, there is kind of a phonetic and spelling rule. I think it's more a phonetic rule, that it just manifests itself as a spelling rule, that you can't have a word that begins with an S and is then followed by a consonant. If a word begins with an S, it has to be followed by a noun, a vocal. Vocal is how you say vowel. Goodness, in Spanish. So if a word begins with an S, it has to be followed with a vowel. You cannot have a word that begins with S and then a consonant. So we have words that begin with S, of course. We have sacar, sacerdote, seguir, but we don't have words that begin with S and followed by a consonant. And when you have English words that begin with S consonant, they tend to be counterparted in that way with an E before them. So Spanish becomes español, but not español. If you have special or especializar, special, let's say, it's especial. I mean, no offense when I say this, but it's a way to remember this rule that often when you hear Spanish speakers who are learning English, there is a common difficulty that they have in pronouncing words that begin with S and then a consonant. So like saying words like speak or Spanish or special, they might say especial, or they might say Spanish, or they might say speak, and it's because they may not be used to pronouncing a word that begins with an S and then a consonant. I hate to come across like I'm making fun of accents when I say that. Obviously I love languages, and so I try to never make fun of anybody for trying to learn one, but it is a common thing that happens, and it's because of that, and you can learn from that common thing that happens. Last one we have is more for user gun 2-4 medical ones. So scope becomes scopio, and scopy becomes scopia. Oh, I made a mistake. Where's my marker? And it's actually a very crucial mistake, extremely important. So I put scopy becomes scopia, but it actually needs to be scopy becomes scopia with a tilde above the I. That is crucial because it's going to carry into every single example that we have. So some examples: microscopio, endoscopio, telescopio. And then for our scopy to scopia rule, endoscopia, colonoscopia, laparoscopia. All of these have the tilde above that final I. Crucially, you have to stress that's penultimate syllable. You cannot not do that. It will sound wrong. And then I also underlined the second A in laparoscopia because that A, although it is there in the spelling of laparoscopy, in English we don't really pronounce that second A. We just say laparoscopy, almost as if that A were not there. But in Spanish, we don't have, silent vowels like that happens in English. You have to say laparoscopia. Even if you say it really fast, just kind of run it together, laparoscopia. I hope this is of some utility to anybody, and I don't know if people want, maybe I'll make another one because there's a million Latin-based suffixes that we can go over, and it is a very useful tool for learning Spanish. Later.